Mark Stevens now. Good morning to you, Mark.
Morning, Julia.
Good morning. Now, the significance of all of this won't have passed you by. This report, 127 pages. It's not just damning of the Martin Bashir, the Panorama, pretty junior reporter at the time who got this interview. It's damning of all those involved in getting the procuring of the interview, and the cover up a year later, and the subsequent covers up years after years after years, even to last year. Obviously, we now know that this all came out not because the BBC went, oh dear, we've done something awful, but because it was exposed once again by Freedom of Information requests and Earl Spencer speaking out. The prospect of civil action now, the prospect of criminal action. Earl Spencer has called for Scotland Yard to launch a criminal investigation. What crimes have taken place?
Well, the most simple and straightforward one is the deceit that was practiced involved libelling senior palace courtiers. So, for example, they were told that they were sources for newspapers, which was entirely untrue, and rocked a vulnerable woman, Princess Diana, in her faith and trust in those courtiers. So, of course, things were exacerbated by that. But there were also people who lost their jobs. There were people at the palace who lost their job. And there was also, of course, the designer who mocked up completely innocently for Martin Bashir the fake bank accounts. And he never worked for the BBC again. Yeah. So he's probably got a claim for the last 25 years at 100,000 a year. And that alone is £2.5 million. So this is a serious amount of licence payer money that is being cast about here.
And no doubt that the huge extra fees for the lawyers as well. I mean, again, it's our money being used to cover up bad doings by people who were on our payroll already. But in terms of
well, of course, the other thing about that is that this would be far, far cheaper if people had come clean at the beginning. Yeah. It's always the cover-up that causes the problems. And of course, the BBC hopes Lord Dyson's report would draw a line under it. Of course, it doesn't, because what it does is leave open the discussion, because essentially he stops looking at things in 1994. What he hasn't done is been able to look at the way in which the Freedom of Information requests were dealt with and the 25-year cover-up.
So not 1994. Sorry, Mark, not 1994. That was obviously 2004.
2004.
Right, of course, and we know, and again, the cover-ups continue from then on. Very senior figures involved, right up to Lord Hall, right up to other leading figures. Lord Burt, although somehow seems to, as former Director General, get away scot-free on this. But the idea that this interview, the interview with the wife of the estranged wife of the future King of England, that interview on Panorama would not have gone up right to the very, very top echelons before, after. And every time an allegation was made, that would not go right to the top is frankly a nonsense, isn't it? And that's where we also
It totally is. And of course, the other thing about this was the scoop of the decade. Yeah. As you say, millions of people watched the interview live, and this was a relatively junior reporter, and all other more senior reporters hadn't been able to get in. And the only reason he got in was to betray the trust that Lord Earl Spencer had placed in him and get an introduction to his sister. And the thing that's quite astonishing about this, in any normal organisation, once the forgery has been discovered, you'd call the police in and see whether prosecution was appropriate, and you would have instantly dismissed them for the deceit that had been practiced. Instead, the BBC turns this man into their religious correspondent. It beggars belief.
Yeah, indeed. Again, we saw this again with what happened with Jimmy Savile. I think there are lots of echoes here. When the Newsnight wanted to do a report exposing Jimmy Savile and his horrific abuse of children, the BBC basically sat on it, and everybody involved in it basically ended up being sidelined or losing their job, forced out of the BBC, whereas those who insisted on the cover-up, they pretty much all to a man and woman got promoted. Is this an endemic problem at the BBC? Is this something that can be resolved? And how many heads do you think are going to have to roll for there to be trust in the BBC again? Or do you think that that's now gone for good?
Well, I think that there has to be a change, but it has to be a demonstrable change. So they've got to demonstrate that they've done absolutely everything, that they've made reparations to the people who were essentially abused by this deceit. And as a consequence of that, there are going to be court actions, and that cover up and the failure to answer straightforwardly the Freedom of Information Act, which is there to hold them accountable and to deal with that properly, I think is going to be exposed in the civil proceedings to come. And they will be scrutiny. So rather than drawing a line under this in Dyson's report, this is merely chapter 1. Yeah. Chapter 2 is probably uglier and follows in the civil courts of London.
But what about criminal courts? As I mentioned earlier, Giles Spencer has called for Scotland Yard to launch a criminal investigation.
Well, as I said, in any normal organisation, when you discover forgery, you would have called in the police to ask, is there something here that should be prosecuted? Mm-hmm. The fact that they didn't even do that also smacks of something of a cover-up, because they obviously didn't want the scrutiny, particularly because it was embarrassing for them how they had dealt with Princess Diana. And so, of course, the police must have a look at this now. It may be that the moment has passed, but there is no time limit on criminal prosecutions, and clearly the police should look into it.
Mark Stevens, thank you very much for joining us. Media lawyer Mark Stevens.